We're going to start with my presentation. As I said, CJ and I are going to talk about models of training, theories of training, which I would argue aren't really theories at all. And by this, I don't mean like periodized versus linear or 531 versus Texas. I mean the so-called theories of adaptation, stuff like general adaptation syndrome and SRA and fitness fatigue and SFRA and so on. That's what we're going to talk about. What are they and are they useful? I've always loved this quote: in theory, theory and practice are the same, but in practice, they're different. The earliest attribution I could find is to one Walter Savage in his classic text on programming. Now, he was talking about computer programming, but if anything, his quote is even more applicable to our endeavor. So, to begin, I think that any biological model of training must account for certain universal sun comes up every day sort of phenomena, right? Increasing load increases adaptation and increases performance improvement. The absence of loading, the lack of a training stimulus leads to a plateau and a lack of improvement, and an excessive training stimulus leads to maladaptation and performance decline and overtraining and exhaustion. And there may be other phenomena that a good training model has to encompass as well. That's science moving in the correct direction, from observation to hypothesis and modeling instead of the other way around. So this is the classic stress recovery adaptation curve, what some people call the supercompensation curve, and what some people call the general adaptation syndrome curve, although it's not really. Let's just call it the SRA curve. And we all know this story. We have time on the abscissa, or the x-axis. We have performance on the ordinate, or the y-axis. And you all know how this works. I'm not going to go into it in great detail because there's not a lot of detail. This is an entirely descriptive and entirely reductive model of training. It can, of course, be mapped onto all of the phenomena that we said any model of training must address. Again, it just pictures the world. It pictures everyday phenomena. Its explanatory power is minimal, I believe, and I think CJ and I would agree that its predictive and its prescriptive powers are also minimal beyond a very general perspective. We're all familiar with how it can be mapped on to the phenomena of progressive overload, and it can be mapped on to the overreaching and overtraining regimes, like so. So the SRA model is a very simple model, and its very simplicity allows it to be very grossly applied to a wide range of training and programming approaches. And it seems to me that this SRA model is quite obviously implicit rather than explicit. In other words, it assumes that there are multiple complex underlying processes operating in parallel and in sequence to produce this oscillation in performance, this SRA curve, and the ultimate physiological outcome. But it does not, and it seeks not, to either enumerate or explain what those underlying processes are. It simply pictures them. It doesn't really explain them except in a sort of vague, teleologic, unhelpful sense. So any simple and reductive model is going to invite elaboration, more speculation, and ultimately even direct challenges to that model. And the SRA curve is no exception. So we have this quote in their 2006 text, The Science and Practice of Strength Training, by Zatsiorsky and Kraemer. This is a mere assertion. In general, the theory of supercompensation is too simple to be correct. Now, mind you, they don't actually demonstrate or even argue anything of the sort. They simply assert it and expect us to, swallow. which we are inclined to do because this sentiment has an undeniable appeal. And the simple fact is that monkeys love fancy, shiny, complex new things. And so we have the emergence of different models of training. Perhaps most notably, the very popular fitness fatigue model that was first put forth by Bannister as an output of his impulse response model. CJ is going to talk about this in more detail. But to summarize, in the fitness fatigue model, the training bout is supposed to impose a training stress, a manifold training stress at multiple levels: the histological, cellular, bioenergetic, neural, and affective levels, from which the trainee must recover along this red line here. Now, the fitness fatigue model doesn't really tell us what these individual stresses are, and this fatigue element of the FitFat model seems to me to be implicit in the SRA model as well. It's just made explicit in the fitness fatigue model. This model also assumes that a training bout initiates a bunch of fitness processes, in other words, adaptive processes, that are depicted in this blue line here. And once again, there's nothing particularly explanatory or revealing about this fitness curve, I don't believe, and it is also implicit in the SRA model. So it doesn't really add a whole lot of detail to the SRA curve, except for one thing. The fitness fatigue model assumes that both of these processes decay, right? So they both return to baseline. But the fatigue process, which is deeper and more profound than the fitness process, decays back to baseline earlier than the fitness processes, assuming that the stress has been properly formulated and properly delivered, such that there is a sweet spot, say 48 to 72 hours out, where performance is enhanced and another training bout can be delivered at higher loading to drive progressive overload and continuing adaptation. In fact, time constants have been formulated for these two processes, the decay of these two processes. And there are computer modeling papers galore in the literature, but the fit of this model to actual human athletes has, on my reading, been pretty uneven and unconvincing, and in any event, fitting these time constants to an individual athlete presents certain resource and technological barriers that make it difficult to apply to the general population. Moreover, as I hope I've sort of suggested here for the last few moments, the fitness fatigue model is really just a decomposition of the SRA model, a dissection of the SRA model. In fact, as stated explicitly in this review article by Chu and Barnes, it is important to note here that the fitness fatigue model is not necessarily an alternative to the GAS, by which he means the SRA, but rather a better representation of stimulation and response. Indeed, the resultant change in performance as described in this model is identical to the GAS, to the SRA. In other words, when we subtract the fatigue curve from the fitness curve, we get the SRA curve. Chu and Barnes then go on to say that this unpacking of the curve into fitness and fatigue frequencies is important for the development of training programs. What they don't really tell us is how that's important. In fact, another descriptive reductive model, the SFRA, Stress Fitness Recovery Adaptation Model, doesn't even attempt to elaborate or change the performance curve, but merely explicitly labels the deflection in performance as fatigue, and its recovery to and above baseline as recovery. In other words, it makes explicit the stunning revelation that a training bout, the decline in performance after a training bout, corresponds to that complex of biological and and cognitive and affective processes that we call fatigue. And that rest results in a dissipation of fatigue, or what old SRA fuddy-duddies would just call recovery. So here we get a non-decomposed performance curve, again, with performance on the ordinate and time on the abscissa, that is supposed to be distinct from the SRA because we labeled it differently. On my reading, it's not clear to me in the literature how this differential labeling of what is basically an SRA curve helps make us better coaches or design better programs for our clients. With the possible exception that SFRA claims that the SRA does not acknowledge that differential stresses produce differential levels of fatigue and differential levels of adaptation, which is news to me. So, to bloviate a little bit more on models. These are all models of methane, CH4. Which one of them is true? None of them are true, right? Methane doesn't look like any of these models. They all leave something out. Which one of them is too simple to be correct? They're all too simple to be correct, right? But some of them, in fact, all of them, have their uses in teaching and chemistry and engineering and research. One of these guys can tell you more about gravitation than the other one, right? But he's not the one that you use for mechanics on Earth or at non-relativistic speeds or to send Trump to Mars. For that, you use the theory of the guy who's too simple to be correct. This is the preliminary catabolism of glucose. It tells you the stoichiometry of glucose and the electron carriers and CO2 and proton and all of that. Now, if you're doing a radiolabel experiment, this might be all you need to know, right? But it leaves a lot of stuff out. It's too simple to be correct. Here's a more elaborate model of these processes showing how they're interconnected and giving you a lot of insight into how they might be regulated. But they also leave a lot of stuff out. It's too simple to be correct. So I don't want to belabor this. This brings me to the work of one George Box, a very important 20th century statistician and scientist who had this to say in a very important paper published in 1976: all models are wrong, but some are useful. And he goes on to say that since all models are wrong, the scientists must be alert to what is importantly wrong. It is inappropriate to be concerned about mice when there are tigers about. And goes on to say, again, since all models are wrong, the scientists cannot obtain a correct one by excessive elaboration. Just as the ability to devise simple but evocative models is the signature of the great scientists, so over-elaboration and over-parameterization is often the mark of mediocrity. But let's just say that this is too simple to be correct. We can, as we have seen, deconstruct this curve into composite fitness and fatigue curve, a sort of a primitive Fourier analysis, sort of, in a way. However, we can deconstruct the fitness curve into multiple component curves as well. We can continue this process. Muscle protein synthesis, reestablishment of ionic gradients, reestablishment of muscle glycogen, and so on, right? You want more? We can always come up with more, right? We can, muscle protein synthesis alone, the initiation of muscle protein synthesis involves over 140 proteins and ribonuclear proteins. So you want more? We can come up with more. We can deconstruct the fatigue curve as well into multiple component processes. In other words, we can come up with a model of adaptation that is far more complex than fitness fatigue, right? But will be not simple enough to use. So the question we have to ask is, how many biological processes contribute to fitness, how many contribute to fatigue, and how many do we need to know about? So, yeah, it's turtles all the way down, but you don't have to name or even see all the turtles to get the job done, right? So you just don't need to know quantum chemistry to make a souffle, right? You don't need to know the Schrodinger wave equation for the carbon-hydrogen bond to be a biochemist, and you don't need to know computer science to make an Excel spreadsheet, and maybe you don't need to know all the steps in muscle protein synthesis to tell your client to eat after a workout, right? So at what point does this level of analysis become theoretically fruitful, experimentally tractable, or practically useful? A model of training, like any other scientific model, can't just be descriptive. It must also be predictive. And in the case of a model of training, it has to be prescriptive. It has to be distinctly prescriptive, right? It has to give us a prescription that another model won't. And so that allows us to discriminate between training models. And when it comes to model validation and discrimination, I can think of two broad domains, if you'll forgive me. Physiological validation, including validation at the biomolecular, histological, and neuroendocrine levels, and practical validation, which means at the program development and performance levels. And so I took a dive into the literature looking at time course data on various physiological processes known to or thought to underlie the processes of adaptation and recovery. This was a very, very coarse, crude process, in part because it is shocking how little time course data there is in the exercise physiology literature about these processes, right? There's so much that we don't know that has never even apparently been looked at. So bear all that in mind as we proceed. So this, for example, is RNA transcription and muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown. And you can see the time course here, I hope, is day 1, day 2, out through day 7. This is glycogen restoration in the muscle, the classic supercompensation curve, and whole body insulin sensitivity. This is the best consensus I could come up with on the wildly divergent data on excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, which is all over the place. Histological damage, most of the data seems to suggest that it peaks here between day 2 and day 3, although CJ will show you some data, I think, going out to 3 weeks. So put that in your fitness fatigue pipe and smoke it. This is force production after a training bout. It is shocking how little we know about the time course of force production recovery after a training bout. This was the best I could come up with based on very little data. So this was all a very, very crude exercise. And I then compounded my sins by taking all of those curves and putting them on the same timeline here, right? This is back of the envelope shit, people, right? This is very, very crude, right? That all said, it looks like a fitness fatigue model to me, which, for reasons I hope I've made clear, means it looks exactly like an SRA curve too, right? So it seems that there may be an opportunity for us to validate some of these underlying physiological processes that are going on, which leads us to the issue of practical validation. Consider the following scenario. It's an experiment by Fry in 2000. A bunch of bros who claim to have been trained male subjects, let's just say that they were late intermediates, are required to perform near maximal squats, multiple sets of near maximal squats, 3 days a week, for every week for 3 weeks. No light days, no medium days, nothing like that. They just go in and redline it 3 days a week for 3 weeks. Okay? You won't be surprised to find that their strength did not improve and their sprint speed declined after this stupidity, right? I think they, well, I don't know what the tonnage, what the actual tonnage was, right? But they were at 95%. Now, I say you won't be surprised. Which of these models, SRA, SFRA, or FitFat, allows you to predict that these guys were sucking wind at the end of the 3 weeks and that their strength and sprint speed did not improve? Which one of those models? Or let me ask you this. Did you need a model to make that prediction? No. And yet, Chu and Barnes claim that this finding supports fitness fatigue over SRA. How? I love this quote from this paper. It's Clark and Skiba, I think. It remains, this is about fitness fatigue, by the way, it remains unclear how much of the model's utility was due to its ability to accurately predict the dynamics of fatigue, fitness, adaptation, and performance, because it models in a general sense the kinetics of human fatigue, adaptation, and performance. Put another way, different model parameters may have resulted in similar conclusions with respect to the absolute training prescription, unquote. This is a pro-fitness fatigue paper, right? And they're saying, they're forced to say, you know, maybe yes, maybe no, anything is possible. So, yeah. In my opinion, a model to be considered actually different from another model, and certainly to be considered superior or inferior to another model, must produce a distinctive exclusive prescription. In other words, you need to be able to show me that model A will generate program A, but not program B and not program C. And that model B will be generative of program B, but never program A or program C, and so on. And I don't think you can do that. First of all, I don't think you have the data to do that. And secondly, these models all picture the same underlying general universal observations. They're all just slightly different pictures of the same underlying reality. But even if you could somehow show me that these models were generative of distinct programming prescription, as an advocate of one of these models over the other, you would still have all of your work ahead of you, because you would then have to show me that these distinct programs were different in their actual performance, and one of them was actually superior to the others in properly conducted, properly designed, head-to-head trials using the correct subjects and the correct number of subjects with the correct outcome measures over the correct interval. And I believe that the exercise science community has made it amply clear that they are not up to that task, right? So what are we left with? You have to be able to derive different programs from these different models and show definitively that the prescriptions are superior or inferior to one another. So I think we have a real problem, right? If we can't distinguish between these programs in the real world, if we can't have them generate differential prescriptions that suggest what we would call a critical experiment to distinguish between them, what are we left with? If there is no fact of the matter to argue about, what is there to argue about, right? What are we really talking about, right? If there is no fact of the matter to argue about, we're engaged in biometaphysical speculation, right? Where one picture is just as good as another, right? And arguing about these things becomes a metaphysical argument. And that can be fun. It can be a great way to spend an afternoon with, you know, good friends, good conversation, and a few ounces of good marijuana, but I'm not sure exactly where it gets us as coaches. So, I know CJ will have a different look on all of this, but let's move on. In the words of a great late 20th century philosopher, Thomas Petty, Let's get to the point. Let's roll another joint, and let's move on. Oh, it's interesting to note, as one final thing on this training metaphysics issue, in the Science and Practice of Strength Training, 2006, Zatsiorsky and Kraemer make this mere assertion that the supercompensation curve is too simple to be correct, and fitness fatigue is the order of the day, although they don't really show it. 2014, Fleck and Kraemer come out with this Designing Resistance Training Programs, 4th edition, and I can't find any reference anywhere in the book to Cellier, General Adaptation Syndrome, fitness fatigue, SRA. In other words, they just completely dispensed. They wrote a whole book on programming and completely dispensed with these models altogether. Interesting, isn't it? Let's talk briefly about periodization, just to bring things down to earth and sort of cleanse your palate. Periodization is the standard paradigm for athletic development since the 1960s and can be traced back to an application of the GAS and SRA models. In general, periodization is characterized by a cyclic, periodic, or self-similar hierarchical structure, progression from high volume to high intensity, and increasing emphasis as the period progresses on technical and sport-specific work. You're all familiar with this. And so you end up with this self-similar structure where the periodization paradigm is broken down into microcycles of, say, a week, mesocycles of, say, a month, and macrocycles of anywhere from, say, 4 months to a month to an entire Olympic cycle, right? In fact, in this interesting paper, I can't read the authors from here, and I forgot who they were. This is a couple of guys. And they argue that periodization has a self-similar structure. In other words, it has a fractal geometry, like a piece of broccoli or a coastline, right? And so that's really cool. I'm not sure how that helps us, but it's pretty cool, except they do make one point in this paper. And here's this quote from the paper that I really like. Chaos on fractal theories tell us that if two variables differ by an arbitrarily small amount at the beginning, they will diverge dramatically over the long run. This will cause the system to be unpredictable over time. That's your sensitive dependence on initial conditions, right? This is basically a fancy way of saying best laid plans of mice and men, no plan of battle survives contact with the enemy, and your programming must be progressively individualized to the athlete on the platform in front of you over time, right? Which you already know, but now you get to say it with chaos theory and fractals. So take another toke. This brings us to this great paper by CSEC, 2008, Limitations of the Periodization Research, and this great quote, surprisingly little about periodization is supported in the research despite the fact that it is widely used and widely written about, despite the numerous presentations on this topic, and despite the fact that it apparently just works based on practical observation. CSEC then goes on in this paper, which I suggest you all get, to enumerate very serious problems with periodization research, which, again, periodization is the dominant programming paradigm of the 20th and 21st centuries. So if there are problems with periodization research, there's problems with programming research, right? Periodization research is primarily applicable to strength and power sports. Well, that's not a problem for us, right? The research rarely uses athletes as subjects, and here they're not using the word athlete the way I use it in sort of an expansive sense. They're talking about elite or competitive athletes. In other words, the people who have the most to gain from a deep understanding of programming and the optimization of training variables. Those are the people that are the least studied in the literature, because the NFL athlete, the pro basketball athlete, the Olympic athlete, right? You have to get them to take time off from their Olympic training to come participate in your weird fucking experiment, right? At Miskatonic University. And they're not going to do that, right? So those people are totally underrepresented in the research. The use and normalization of volume and intensity are contentious. Basically, what CSEC is talking about here is that a lot of the periodization research has been at pains to normalize work or volume loading between two programs to study them. So we want to study this periodization protocol, and we want to study this periodization protocol, and so to make it fair, we're going to normalize the work between the two protocols, which is exactly not the point, because it may be that one periodization program allows for their greater accumulation of volume loading, which may make it a superior or inferior program. So you've kind of neutered the entire experiment before you even got started. Does that make sense? And studies are small and short. I think I may have mentioned something about this in the past at one time or another. They're small, so they're not properly powered, right? You can't really make good conclusions on the basis of small studies. And they're short, which means that they remove the very thing that periodization is allowing you to address, right? The optimization of training over long periods of time. That's a serious issue. So, we're already running over, and I don't want to take any more time. I'm just going to summarize here. In my opinion, models like SRA and SFRA and fitness fatigue serve as very crude cognitive and pedagogical scaffolding for talking about program design. But there is no indication on my read that they have produced ongoing elucidation of program design or the biology of training. Debate about different theories of training, such as SRA versus FitFat versus SFRA, do not hinge on demonstrably divergent predictions or prescriptions that can be settled by critical experiments, because the models are all primitive, elementary, agranular, and homologous. So 3, therefore, arguing about them amounts to a metaphysical circle jerk. You should use the model that suits your pedagogical, practical, and emotional needs. Just don't kid yourself that it's more or less right than another model, or that it has any deep correspondence to a biological reality. Periodization is, deservedly, in my opinion, the dominant training paradigm of program design, and its application has advanced well beyond the ability of these metaphysical models to inform its development, especially on an individual basis. Periodization clearly works, but critical experiments to evaluate divergent periodization protocols are scarce, and most of this literature is hindered by small, short, improperly controlled studies with inappropriate study populations. Something I meant to say, you've seen the word inappropriate pop up in a couple of these quotes. When a scientist in a scientific paper says inappropriate, that's scientific nice speak for really fucking stupid, right? Finally, I think that we have put the cart before the horse. I think that we have all these arguments over, again, what I think are basically just metaphysical models of training in the absence of a lot of data. We live in an age where bioinformatic research becomes possible and is mandatory, right? I think that going out and learning what the strongest people the world has ever seen and their coaches are actually doing is where the research really should be at this juncture. Instead of spinning out elaborate speculation about how it is that gorillas get strong, I think the job of research should be to go out into the forest and watch some fucking gorillas first, and then take it from there. To proceed from observation to hypothesis, because going the other way doesn't get us anywhere. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to CJ. Thank you very much for your attention.